I spent my career peering into beneath the earth, and I spent my history in gold and base metals and sexy things like diamonds. And lo and behold, there was this well-known hot aquifer in southeast Saskatchewan that everyone was ignoring because it didn't have any oil in it. And the fact that there was this new Saskatchewan, new Canadian resource that had yet to be developed. As a resource entrepreneur, I was excited to dive in. Geothermal is the most untapped baseload energy source that has yet to be exploited. Here in Canada, our average temperature is 0 degrees annually. I mean, not only do we need power, but we need heat as well. And geothermal is the only renewable that can provide both. We were challenged with flow rates. The oil and gas industry tapped us on the shoulder and said, we can solve that. Drill horizontally and you can produce the rates that you require. Almost all of our team is from the oil and gas sector because this is what they do best. They move fluids in the Williston Basin. So this is energy transition in action, where we're using the skills and the technology from the oil and gas industry and redeploying them for the first time ever on renewable power. For decades, geothermal has been hard because it's a resource that you need to spend enormous amounts of dollars to determine what its viability is going to be. Easier renewable energy projects have taken the forefront as geothermal has come along. But now that the world has changed, now there are views on climate change as globally accepted and that we're looking for new low emission energy production, geothermal now is set to take stage. We believe that horizontal drilling in this rib cage design is cracking the code for low temperature sedimentary geothermal for the world.
Hey, everybody. This is Jamie Beard. I'm Executive Director of Project InnerSpace and host of the conference. So I'm for Gretchen Gillis, who had an emergency, unfortunately, and is not able to join. So this is going to be a fun ride. This is the session, What's New in Sedimentary Geothermal, which is pretty exciting. A lot of it's happening on the Texas Gulf Coast, and I've got an awesome panel here. Real quick, before I introduce the panel, a little bit of housekeeping on how to ask questions to the panels. So you'll see in the chat function, you can see all of the folks in the conference who have chosen to make their presence public. And if you put questions in that chat box, only those people in the conference can see them. We cannot. So the panelists can't see them and the moderators can't see them. If you want to ask questions to the panel, there's a blue bar at the bottom of your screen that says ask a question to the presenter. Type that in and we'll get that backstage and we'll be able to ask those questions to the panel. Cool? All right, let's launch. So I'm going to introduce the panelists one by one. They're going to give you a 1 to 2 minute summary of themselves and why they're excited about this topic, and we'll launch right into questions. So welcome panel. Let's have Mark McClure introduce himself first.
Hi, my name is Mark McClure. I'm the CEO of ResFrac Corporation. We make subsurface modeling software. I've worked in geothermal since the outset of my career, going back to 2009 when I was a master's student. I've been an active researcher on particularly in enhanced geothermal systems, but generally in subsurface modeling.
Thanks, Mark. How about you, Tim?
Hey, everyone. Tim Bourgeois here. I'm a vice president of the FerVID group. And our piece is vice presidency, or my piece is vice presidency of geoscience consulting. You might call me the bimodal figure in this panel. I've probably got the most experience of anyone, 35 plus years, all in oil and gas subsurface characterization, and now on this great path of geothermal for the last year. So I'm kind of a bimodal or bipolar person. Spent a lot of time in oil and gas with Shale Oil and BHP. All of the coal face, characterizing the subsurface for large projects, both on land and mostly deep water, Gulf of Mexico and offshore Brazil. So real happy to be here.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. How about you, Danny?
Thanks, Jamie. My name is Danny Ray, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Criterion Energy Partners. We're a Houston-based next-generation geothermal energy company focused on developing decentralized energy projects, which are co-located with commercial and industrial customers to provide combined heating and power using heat from the earth. So I'm really excited about this topic because I got to be a part of the the shale boom effectively in the oil and gas industry. And I see this as that next cutting edge and innovative landscape to apply the same playbook, but also get there a lot faster. So looking forward to the discussion today.
Thanks, Danny. And last but not least, how about you, Albert?
Well, my name is Albert McSpadden. I'm president of Altus Well Experts. I'm maybe also a little bit of a different standout in this group. Our background and expertise is really in tubular design, well casing and completion design. Our background really has been in, for the most, to a large extent, HVHT. So involved in the design, stress analysis for HVHT wells, some really hot areas of the world, the Central North Sea, but also here in the States. And we've been involved quite a bit as well in shale and what's going on in the shale world, particularly from the standpoint of well integrity, which has really been one of the big challenges of the shale revolution. A lot of people talking about that, and we've been part of that conversation. But we have been involved in geothermal as well. So we've been involved in the design of conventional geothermal, which has its stress challenges, if you will. And then also we've gotten involved in some studies for different groups. One lately is Icarus Technologies, who are trying to develop some closed loop geothermal systems. So kind of looked at it from different aspects, but again, mainly on understanding what's this going to do our well bore, and is it going to perform for the life of the well and achieve what the designers and the economic hopes of that well is going to be.
Thank you, Albert. All right, awesome. Thank you for the intros panel. So how about we launch real quick? You know, this isn't a new topic, sedimentary geothermal. It's been quite the discussion also, you know, even in Texas and a focus in the US for decades. But this has become a trending topic in geothermal in the last few years. And the first question I'd like to ask and just throw out to you all with, for your opinion is, why is that? Why is it all of a sudden that people are excited about sedimentary geothermal more than they had been in the past decades? What are your thoughts? Why don't you start, Tim?
Well, hey, I think that there's a couple of things working here. One is that new drilling technologies are able to maybe unlock geothermal heat, the heat energy from the subsurface in a more efficient way. And also, even more importantly, perhaps, is that some new surface kit has been developed that can extract usable energy for electrical production at lower temperatures, lower enthalpy, let's say. And so that really broadens the scope of where this geothermal power could be applied right across the United States and likely around the world. So I think that's really exciting.
What about other panelists? Thoughts?
Well, I'll certainly say, and from our experience, when you look at some of the wells, some of the more extreme wells in the North Sea or the Haynesville or wherever, Cotton Valley, start looking at reservoir temperatures of 450, okay, which is certainly a lot less than conventional geothermal, but that's quite hot. And it just, in the process of circulating drilling fluids and so forth, you bring a lot of heat to the surface, so much so that sometimes we have to use mud coolers to cool things off. Well, perhaps click to somebody, well, that's heat, and let's not cool it off. Let's get it and let's use it. So it's right there on our doorstep.
Yeah. Well, why don't we, before we launch too far into this, a question that comes up pretty often, and I think this is across the board these days in geothermal, is a question of definitions and terminology. So maybe we can visit that first before we launch and decide what we're talking about exactly when we're talking about sedimentary geothermal, because my next question is going to be, well, how big is this globally? But we need to define it first, right? So, I've heard it as hot, dry rock in sedimentary basins. I've heard it as, it doesn't matter if it's dry, it can be wet too. So sedimentary aquifers, but then that starts getting into hydrothermal. Where do you draw the line? How would you all define sedimentary geothermal?
Well, I'll go. This is Mark. I would define it as a geothermal reservoir that is in sedimentary rock, not metamorphic or igneous rock. But I think it'd be helpful to give a little pro and con on this really quickly. Sedimentary rocks are going to be easier to characterize. There's a humongous number of them, which means we can go out and find ideal formation properties and target sites very effectively. There's a lot of reservoir engineering advantages to sedimentary formations. Why has there been less sedimentary geothermal produced over the years? Because sedimentary formations are usually not as hot. If they were really hot, they would have been cooked into metamorphic rock. And if you go deep enough, you always eventually reach igneous rock. So really the challenge on sedimentary rock for geothermal is you're going to be a little bit lower temperature. And so as Tim alluded to, maybe different power plant designs, and also direct use is actually a huge part of geothermal for heating and cooling. And so really, I think when you look at sedimentary, you're looking at getting great reservoirs. You should be able to find great reservoirs, but maybe a little bit lower temperature than traditional geothermal, and figuring out how to make that work economically.
Other panelists?
Yeah, I think one tough thing about geothermal is that for porous media, the current technology belief is that somewhere around 150 C is needed for the new technology that's coming out. And that's right at the cusp of where reservoir properties really degrade. And so you're kind of at that balance point of when is the rock turned into hot, dry rock, which is, you're talking within 1,000 feet, 300 meters of slop in there, if you will. So that makes a kind of a balance point that happens there that you have to consider when you're designing your geothermal project installation for the subsurface characterization part of it. Yeah.
Let's segue into size. One thing that I've heard in terms of themes with oil and gas entities engaging in geothermal increasingly is that they need to see global scale. There needs to be the potential for global scale for them to get truly excited and start engaging in projects. So the question becomes, when we scale geothermal into sedimentary basins, is that sufficient in terms of global scale for oil and gas engagement? What are your thoughts? And I'd love to hear remarks generally from all of you on what what your view is on the size of this resource globally, and where should we do this in the world?
Yeah, I'll just jump in real quick, Jamie. So I think what's maybe characteristic of conventional geothermal is heat anomalies, right, that are close to the surface of the earth. Fracture dominated systems, convection heat flow, relatively limited in their geographic location. So I think the neat thing about sedimentary rock is that it tends to be more laterally extensive. And so, the idea of going to scale geothermal in sedimentary basins really makes a lot of sense because of those reservoir characteristics. And we got to, in order to get geothermal to scale, we have to make it cost competitive. And that means we have to work on our costs in the best way we know how to do that. Just like we saw in the unconventional oil and gas space, is to drive scale and continuous improvement into the development costs. And so that's I think really important for getting to that scale. That's going to bring other investment from bigger stakeholders into the industry.
Anybody else have a comment?
Yeah, Jamie, I think that one thing we haven't really said was that sedimentary rocks sit on top of the basement rocks, the igneous rocks, and that's why sedimentary is more being talked about at present. I think that as we learn about the new kit, if it actually works and is successful, we can learn about where the low end range of that kit could be, and that will greatly expand the accessible regions of the world. I'll give a shout out to you for the project InnerSpace project that's coming up. That work's coming up to kind of define, the aerial extent of geothermal capacity in large metropolitan areas around the world, and so that'll help with that question about global impact. Being a U.S. citizen and things, I'm concentrating mostly in the U.S. That's just the way it is, and so. I've seen maps from the SMU geothermal labs that show, at easily reached drilling depths, in the deep water, they drill to 20,000 feet without even thinking about it, 10,000 foot holes or post holes for those guys. So I think that at 20,000 feet, SMU maps show 150C through at least 50%, maybe more percent of the aerial extent of the United States alone. So I think that those factors will really increase the footprint of geothermal, or can at least, give us an advantage.
What about
Yeah,
globally?
I would just echo that and say, in my mind, anytime you see an HVHT field, if you drill a dry hole in an HVHT field, well, you've just created yourself a nice opportunity for geothermal. And there's a lot of those around the world.
So true.
Also, I would just say, just like shale, the shale revolution was very US based. Well, now they're doing it in Canada and in China and in the Vaca Muerta in Argentina. So once you get a technical and economic working paradigm going, it's very easy to export that into around the world, as we've seen.
So is that the trend you see then? Is launching in Texas just as the shale boom did, and exporting that globally into other sedimentary basins? How do you see this playing out? And I'll throw that just to the panel at large. Mark, I think I interrupted you when I was asking a question. Say what you were going to say, and then you have to answer my new question.
I'll try to answer your question too. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of resource size, there's a gradation. So there's a small number of exceptional resources, and then going down to, I mean, sedimentary rock is everywhere. You go deep, it's hot everywhere. So in theory, the resource is essentially unlimited or vast. But in practice, it's really the demand side and the techno-economics that determine the resource base, right? And so, for example, if we're going to look at direct use, which is at lower temperatures, vast numbers of reservoirs at low temperatures, we can produce high volumes of fluid at high rates at 250 F. But then, what's the demand side for 250 F water? We can do heating and cooling in concentrated places. Then when we look at demand like, residential or urban heating and cooling, that's an exciting area, but it requires a lot of surface infrastructure to be constructed. So really there's kind of a bouquet or an array of different demand side applications for this heat, and our ability to apply those economically really determines ultimately the resource base. So the geology is vast, but it's really the demand side that will determine adoption and cost.
Yeah, like Mark says, the demand side will be driven a lot by influences of cost. How much does it cost to implement these things? And then the regulatory side of that equation as well. Those are big pieces of it. Yeah, and I think it's a beautiful thing about geothermal is that it comes in so many different forms and fashions that I think that really expands the scope and can really help us in terms of reducing the need to use fossil fuels or other types of power that demand issues with the ecology of the world. Yeah.
And as far as why Texas, there's some
go back, Mark, to the Texas point.
Yeah, there's some pretty hot formations in Texas. It's not California, but it's pretty hot. And of course, there's a tremendous oil and gas infrastructure in place that makes that very accessible. And
so here's a follow-on on that. And I'm interested to hear you because Mark, you brought up direct use, so heat. It seems like that would be a difficult proposition, though, to start that type of movement for sedimentary in Texas, because a lot of the focus in Texas is actually on electricity production for geothermal, right? So, and a lot of the movement for direct use is actually happening in Europe. So, does the sedimentary play in Texas, do you see that happening as heat first and then electricity, or electricity and then heat that's exported elsewhere? Like, how is that going to play out in your minds? And this is for everybody. Mark first.
Well, I'm a mere engineer, so that's too difficult of a question for me. But I mean, I would say that, geothermal heat can be used for air conditioning as well. And there's a ton of industrial applications. Just in terms of electricity generation, it's just you got to have it pretty hot, and the lower the temperature, the lower the efficiency and the higher the cost. So that's the balancing act there in terms of power generation.
Yeah, I was going to jump in, Jamie,
Please.
and say, I love what Mark and Tim said about the demands really driving the techno-economics, and that's so huge. And one of the things why now for sedimentary geothermal, but specific to like the Texas Gulf Coast and rolling out not just power, but heat applications, we're really focused on doing exactly that. And I think it becomes a bit complex from an off-taker standpoint, how they can consume that heat. There really has to be the right application for the right specifications that you can deliver. But where those opportunities exist, we really see a strong drive from a techno-economic standpoint to lower the cost, because we know in Texas, the ERCOT market can be quite competitive. That's evolving as we speak. But where you have opportunities to sell BTUs and not just megawatts, you can really drive better economics, which is ultimately what's needed for scale. So that's something we're very focused on. I really see those direct heat applications, but I think the combination of heat and power make a lot of sense initially. And then as we go to scale, we can start to be competitive with just pushing power onto the grid. And so that's a really key part of the equation.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. This is a good segue into technology. So, what's new and what can we transfer from oil and gas specifically to get techno-economics to work, right? So I'd love to hear your perspectives. You all have different projects and papers and research and projects in the pipeline. So, let's talk about that. What specifically can we do in terms of transferring oil and gas technologies, techniques, methodologies, et cetera, into sedimentary geothermal development? And then as a follow-on to that question, can we then transfer those same learnings and technologies into igneous development? And what are the challenges there? So, somebody take that, and then I'd like to hear from a few of you, and let's see if we have some different opinions. Who's going first?
All right, I'll go first since
Okay,
I've been involved in subsurface characterization for a long time. I think one of the really important pieces of geothermal is that as in oil and gas, the earth provides the nugget, the kernel of all of the value there. So proper description of the size of the prize is really important, of course. And then also I think equally important is a description of the risks or the uncertainties in that description, because nobody can actually see below the soles of their feet into the earth and understand it. So we're taking measurements that all have uncertainty. And that uncertainty translates into project risk, uncertainty with clothes on, let's say, with trouble associated with it, is that uncertainty. And so, how can we best describe those risks in a geothermal space rather than an oil and gas space? There will be some overlaps, but there will be some differences too. And then with that proper description, startups like Criterion can design the right facilities and wells on top of that thing to mitigate or to eliminate, obviate those risks. I think that's important. Moving on to igneous rocks, I think a lot of the things we're talking about are kind of can be transferred into igneous rocks, but there are some differences, and perhaps we can learn some things from the folks who have worked that side of the business for their long careers and understand that risk perspective.
Yeah, and I'll work in, as other panelists are considering this set of questions, a question that's come in from the audience. Of course, there's a bunch, but this one caught my eye because we're on the topic. When we're talking about sedimentary, what are we even saying? Are we talking about sand or shale? And I remember, Tim, you brought this up earlier. And what are the differences for folks who haven't thought this through? What are the differences in the geothermal context there? Anybody want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think I'll take that real quick, and I'll kind of roll that into your last question too. So yeah. We're focused on developing geothermal resources in sedimentary basins where you have clastic formations, where the permeability and porosity exists, is kind of our initial target and beachhead market. So there's a couple of reasons for that, but I think just to name a few, predicting flow through porous media, matrix permeability, and with what's been done in more conventional type oil and gas developments, water floods, those types of things tends to be a little bit easier. But then as and less costly as well, if you don't require the large stimulations that might be required to produce through shale or even igneous or metamorphic rocks. So as we go, develop those projects, initially leveraging a lot of existing technology, driving project costs down through lower drilling and completion efforts. Our go-to-market strategy is to step our way and innovate incrementally into more challenging geologies, like tighter and tighter rock, rock that doesn't have fluid in place, and eventually into igneous and metamorphic rocks, where there might be higher temperatures, but no fluid in place or no permeability. So lots of technical challenges to solve. And the best way that we know how to do that is incrementally through innovations and leveraging technology.
Yeah, I
Other
agree. I
comments?
mean, it's clearly either, but Danny's completely right that a high permeability conventional reservoir is a lot easier to maintain high flow rate for a long time without thermal breakthrough. So from a reservoir engineering perspective, if you're going to be willing to take the sacrifice to go to a little bit lower temperature to use a sedimentary formation, you might as well go to a great sedimentary formation. But of course, I mean, you could certainly try to produce from shale as well. You would have to use other pretty different techniques, I think. In terms of technology transfer from oil and gas, I mean, one thing to consider is just oil and gas has gotten a lot better at drilling, and drilling costs have dramatically dropped. So that across the board is fantastic. Obviously the shale revolution has been driven by multi-stage hydraulic fracturing from horizontal wells. If you've ever seen anything I put out, I'm very bullish about using that for geothermal. Although really the hydraulic fracturing designs and the well configurations that you use for, like, let's say granitic rock or even shale may be very different from the well configurations and hydraulic fracturing designs that you might use in a 100 millidarcy conventional reservoir. So hydraulic fracturing is very valuable for anything that involves producing fluid from the subsurface, because it can dramatically improve production at a relatively cost-effective way. But it'll look really different in different types of reservoirs, just depending on what the formation properties are.
All right, thanks, Shell. And of course, someone's decided to weed eat right outside my window right now. So I apologize to the audience if you hear that. We're going to power through it, but you can only risk mitigate so much these things. Let's chat real quick about temperature differences. It's a trend I'm seeing in the audience questions, and it's one that I had on to ask you anyway. So let's go ahead and dive into that. A lot has been said about the negative aspects of lower temperatures in geothermal. But what's the flip side of that, right? So that really the consciousness has been drill deeper, hotter. We need to get to super hot resources, which is essentially the rest of our day. We've got this super hot symposium coming. But if we're talking about sedimentary as low hanging fruit and it's lower temperatures, what do we get? What's the positive of going for lower temperatures in geothermal as opposed to the deeper, hotter approaches? What are your thoughts?
Well, would like to comment quickly. When you look at conventional geothermal designs, once you start talking about flowing temperatures of 650 degrees Fahrenheit, you're talking about you're going to have plastic deformation of your tubulars. You're going to have a very difficult time with integrity of the cement sheet. Even the drilling, you start drilling through that hot, dry rock, you find that you lose all your drilling fluid. You're drilling blind, you're drilling with air and foam. Very difficult then in those circumstances to get a competent cement sheet. So one of the things I believe you gain is, as we've been doing with HPHT wells, we can drill them to 250 degrees Celsius, 480 degrees Fahrenheit. We can drill into that. We can maintain control of the well. We can get a good well bore. We can probably get a pretty good cement sheet. And therefore, we have some confidence in maintaining well integrity over the life of the well. There are some areas in those hotter regions where there is a loss of well bore, and they have to go in and drill more wells. And so that factors into the economics.
Yeah, I think that the lower temperatures are really important because of the things Albert's talking about here. Is that the higher the temperature, the less likely the well will last. That lifespan has to be maybe 20, 30 years to last the life of the surface kit. That's a big ask. I've been associated with a lot of wells in the oil and gas world and at lower temperatures, and that would be a long-term issue, even in lower temperatures. So You've got a big ask there. And one thing I'll point out too is that the requirements are a little different than in the oil and gas world for geothermal. Geothermal, that energy is used immediately at the plant. Oil and gas you produce out, and that energy is used later. So you can allow for some production decline, let's say, or wells to go offline. That's okay. It's not okay in geothermal, where if that plant goes down and mom flips the light switch and it doesn't come on, that's a big deal, right? So we have to think about that. And I think that's a real advantage of lower temperature, lower enthalpy heat extraction.
I've got a question from the audience too, and there's actually a few that are around this topic, which is
hey, Jamie, I don't want to interrupt you, but Danny did have maybe a follow on there.
Yeah,
ahead,
sorry,
Danny.
I just want to make one comment. There are trade-offs like there are with anything, and we absolutely believe that deeper, hotter is the way of the future. But some of the things we're trading off in sediment, lower temperature, medium to low enthalpy sedimentary basin development is better permeability, porosity, propensity to flow for maybe a slightly lower temperature, but also tools and technologies that are commercial today that can be deployed into those developments to get to a commercial project faster as soon as possible.
Yeah. So speaking, go ahead, Mark.
When you go about 175 C and up, electronics start to fry and elastomers start to struggle. So essentially below that temperature, you can just use oil and gas technology off the shelf and it's great. When you're at 175 to maybe 250, you can use advanced technology, but it's starting to get more challenging. You're having to do things like metal on metal seals. And then once you're getting up above 250 to 300, you're getting into really challenging technology. So those are kinds of the ranges. So yeah, going to 150 C, it's less efficient thermal production, but can be way easier operationally, and you can use everything off the shelf.
So combining a few. Go ahead, Albert. Last one, and then we're going to segue.
The conversation today has been a lot of it has been drilling, and just the efficiencies of drilling and factor drilling. We can do that in shale. On the completion side, I would just mention there are things that we've been doing to control temperatures. Vacuum insulated tubing, vacuum insulated casing, things in permafrost, things in SAGD. A lot of times we're trying to prevent the heat from getting out and melting the permafrost. Well, those tools are also very important in allowing the heat to reach the surface. So there are things in a lot of a kit is available in terms of fine tuning the thermodynamics of the wellbore, both the cement sheath and even fluids that can be insulative or conductive as desired. That I think we've got tools where we can refine it and get as much juice as possible heat-wise as we try to bring that heat up to surface.
Thanks, Albert. We have about 15 minutes left in the session. We have a lot of questions, and so I'd like to segue and try to combine some into one and get to as many as we can. Let's start with a trend I'm seeing in the questions about demonstrations. So there's a lot of comments about this sounds good, but where has this been done? Where is there a demonstration? What demonstrations are planned? What's on the horizon? Is there any proof that this works? There's quite a few comments about low thermal conductivity of sedimentary basins, and where's the proof, essentially. So let's chat a bit about that. How do we know this is going to work? Where are there going to be demonstrations? Where are there demonstrations? Has this been done? What's on the horizon? Let's hear from you all. Danny, you want to start that one?
Yeah, sure. I think that's appropriate. So we are gearing up for a demonstration project in the second half of this year here in Texas, where I'm located. I can't disclose specifically where that's at, but hopefully in the next couple of months, we'll be able to share a lot more details about that. But the idea is to do exactly that, de-risk the resource and improve viability, technical viability, and then a pathway to commercial feasibility as well. So I think there's some good examples of demonstrations that have been done in the past. In Texas, many years ago, by the DOE-funded project, tested geopressured systems. Also, Sage Geosystems in South Texas has done a demonstration. I believe they're even in Pivot here, they're going to be speaking about some of those results. So I think it's coming. I know everyone's excited. I can't tell you how excited I am to get out there and get some boots on the ground. We're in the process of doing that, and I know other companies are too. So I think it all works on paper. We just need to show that it works in the field, and it's coming.
Other comments?
I think Danny's spot on here in that, we need to get a proof of concept of to really prove it to the rest of the world. And once we do, then I think geothermal will really gather some legs in the sedimentary piece here. The thing I would layer onto that is, that first test, it's really important that it is successful and that it does not fail. I tell people it must not fail because of subsurface characterization issues. That would be an unhappy thing, because then you have to explain away why it didn't work. And so let's not be that portion of any issues there. We want this thing to be successful and then gather legs. Wind and solar have proven concepts. We get this off the ground and moving. I think it's really going to be exciting.
There's a question that actually just came in that is a good follow-up to what you just said, Tim, which is, what about exploration risks of sedimentary geothermal? So, and the question is longer than that, but let's dig into that just for a second. What are they? Why, why do they exist, and how do we mitigate them?
I'll answer that question and also the previous one a little more. I mean, sedimentary geothermal has been around for a really, really long time. Paris has a heating and cooling network from right underneath their feet in sedimentary rock. There's a lot of sedimentary geothermal in like Europe already. And also, the InRel has done some really nice work mapping out opportunities in the US that would be a good Google search for somebody. I mean, exploration risk ought to be a lot lower. There are so many oil and gas wells drilled throughout the United States of America that, we really know a lot about what the subsurface looks like. You can hardly go 10 miles in Texas without hitting an oil and gas well somewhere. So it should be much, much lower than something like where you're looking for an oil trap in oil and gas exploration. It's much lower risk.
Any other comments?
Yeah, I would say, every oil well, every well design we've been involved with has been involved thermal design to quite extent. It's exchange of heat between the lower subsurface and the surface. We understand those temperatures. So, for example, some of those dynamics are coming into play in closed loop geothermal. And so Icarus that we work with on a recent paper that's coming up, and the SBE ATCE is working with Calpine. I think they have a test project coming up this fall as well. And that's for a closed loop system. So a little bit maybe different flavor, but still working with known components. And we understand the thermodynamics of these things.
I'll add a little bit.
Yeah,
I think that exploration risk is it's different than oil and gas. So some of the audience may be thinking about that in that space. And it's taken me a while to get my head around that too, is that because geothermal exploits the heat of the earth rather than the actual materials, there's a different way to think about it. And so, if you have different concepts, different ways to exploit that heat, one of them being EGS, really, you're looking for a floor of temperature, of enthalpy, if you will, where you can actually start to extract this heat, if that's one of the tools in your toolkit. And then on the flip side of porous media, I think it's going to be important to have in your concept an injection scheme, because the reservoirs, they're porous and permeable, but to have enough lifespan at the rates needed to keep a power plant working 24/7 for 20 years, that's a big ask. I think most large oil developments don't last that long, and so I think injection is going to be needed in that space. Yeah.
We have two additional themes of questions that I want to rush and get into before we run out of time, because they're important. There's one theme of new or trending topics in geothermal generally and how they might apply in the sedimentary context. We've talked about closed loop, but I'm also seeing questions about lithium mining, nickel mining, other precious metals from sedimentary projects. I'm also seeing questions about combining sedimentary geothermal with CO2, supercritical CO2, carbon sequestration in reservoirs, etc. What comments or thoughts do you all have about how far off those types of concepts might be, and how big of an opportunity that is for sedimentary geothermal generally?
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say tremendous opportunity. I think geothermal can underline the energy transition in a number of ways, whether that's carbon sequestration or hydrogen production. I think from our standpoint, we're very careful about stacking risk on risk. So we don't want to be too many things at this point. And some of those technologies have their own technology risk associated with them, but absolutely integration of those energy transition themes, but also even hybridization of generation, whether that's solar, wind, batteries, or even co-production with oil and gas. I think those are all really big themes as well. But I think it's easy to get excited about a Swiss Army knife looking project, right? That has lots of different attributes to it, and I think that's in our future. But want to take steps slowly to get to commercialization while managing that technology risk, and then we'll get there. Is my opinion.
Other thoughts? All right, let's talk about seismicity. There are a lot of questions all over on this. The questions differ, but essentially it is, can we? The themes seem to be, can we transition and translate oil and gas learnings, Oklahoma, et cetera, into geothermal? How useful is that going to be? Can seismicity risk be fully mitigated, mostly mitigated? What are the thoughts of the panel? And also there seems to be a lot of questions about the significance of seismicity risk in sedimentary versus basement formations. So let's chat about this one for a few minutes, since there's so many questions. Who would like to start?
Well, this is right up my alley. I've done a lot of academic research on this subject. The induced seismicity risk in sedimentary formations is much lower than in crystalline formations. So I think it's an almost complete non-issue for sedimentary geothermal. Induced seismicity from water disposal wells is generally happening because they're right above the crystalline basement and they're really injecting into the crystalline basement. So with site characterization, it should be basically zero risk. And if there was an issue, they could shut down the project. So I see this as a virtual non-issue for sedimentary geothermal. It's a minor issue.
You're saying as opposed to geothermal and basement formations?
Geothermal and basement formations, it is a more significant issue. Certainly not a showstopper by any stretch, but it is a more significant issue in crystalline basement, correct?
What are thoughts on? Yeah, keep going.
I was going to say, I mean, while that may be true, if we're going to be doing a significant amount of fracturing and trying to open up the earth and get new pathways for fluid, the problem with fractures is you can't always predict where they're going to propagate. Sometimes, they don't propagate where we want, or we end up with connectivity between wells we didn't anticipate. So, I would caution that certainly a lot of good work and engineering is being done. I respect that. But once we start disturbing the earth, both thermally and changing the stress situation with our injection activities and fracturing, you may not be able to anticipate exactly where it's all going to go.
Yeah, hydraulic fracturing and sedimentary formations have very, very seldom caused any felt seismicity at the surface, and only in a very small number of places in the earth. That from hydraulic fracture from sedimentary is very unlikely to induce seismicity.
Yeah,
that is felt at the surface.
But I guess as your point was, the Oklahoma wells they were just above some fractured zones.
Earthquakes in Oklahoma are not caused by hydraulic fracturing. They're caused by long-term water disposal wells that inject very large rates for years. That's a very different process than hydraulic fracture.
But if you're having to inject long-term, as was already mentioned, over the life of the field, so not just the fracturing to get your fractures, but injecting down injectors, which produce up co-producers, you're talking about a long-term injection scenario.
Right, but so then you're producing, so in a geothermal situation, you'd be injecting and producing simultaneously. So injecting just to pressure up a formation would be expensive and would make you no geothermal energy. So you'd be injecting to produce. And so you're not going to be pressuring up a formation. Actually, this long-term injection issue is a big deal for CO2 sequestration and has been raised as a major problem for CO2 sequestration. But if you're injecting and producing in pairs, it's not likely to cause earthquakes. I mean, secondary oil production, with water injection and oil production has been done for 100 years and is very unlikely to induce seismicity.
Well, and I'll say also, just to grab this real quick, there's a whole panel later in Pivot about seismicity. So pause on this, come to the panel, and let's argue about it. Because it's a topic that that folks are interested in. Whether everyone has different opinions about how big of an issue it is, but there's definitely a lot of interest. So there's a whole panel on it, but there are a lot of questions. And honestly, just so y'all know, from behind the scenes, I'm watching all these questions come in, and there's a lot. And then people will also make comments, and people are as divided about this in the questions as they are on the panel. So I've got someone that just said this is a non-issue, and then there's another question that said this is a serious issue. So this is, and that's great. Like, that's why we're here. That's why we're here chatting about it.
Well, hey,
we're
Jamie,
about to run out of time.
I think that again, back to the demand side, what our customers and our society demands from us will be some kind of position on it. We should be ready to talk to this issue with facts and with the common language. I think that's going to be a big thing. And I think Project InnerSpace should cover this topic, actually.
And the Department of Energy put together a blue panel group of people who put together an induced seismicity assessment protocol that is a best practice for people to use if they're
right. Yep. And we're actually going to chat about that during the induced seismicity technical discussions and panel. So that's a plan. Awesome. All right, last question before we go to closing statements. What do you see happening between now and 5 years from now in sedimentary geothermal? What's going to get done in the next 5 years? How big will this be in 5 years? And to wrap in another audience question here, where in the world is that going to happen? So, the US, and a lot of you are Texas focused. So, yes, of course, but where else? Where in the world is this going to happen first? What do you think?
I would say there's interesting areas in Nevada. We're closer to some of the more traditional geothermal areas. Interesting zones there. That's kind of what some of the work that EPRIS is doing with Calpine out in that part of the western United States.
Anybody else?
I think that's likely a really good thought. My focus has been Texas and Louisiana, where the DOE spent $200 million, $1980 to characterize the subsurface. But places where geothermal is already instituted, where you could test some of these new concepts, I think that's, because the regulatory issues I think that we're facing in Texas and Louisiana, kind of standing in the way of the commercial issues. There's a lot of headwinds to do it first here in that space. I hope that's not true, but I worry about that. And so maybe Nevada, California, those places would be better suited, and really anywhere where geothermal is in place and you could test these concepts with as an add-on or an adjunct. I think that's probably the low-hanging fruit in terms of getting it done. Yeah.
And by here, you mean Texas Gulf Coast or Gulf Coast generally? Gulf Coast generally.
Yeah.
I found out recently that said in the question, it was, where are we going to be in 5 years? None of y'all have said that. We need some soothsayers here. What's your thought? Let's hear.
So I think in 5 years, something will be proven up and will catch a lot of momentum. And I am excited to be part of that. I'm excited to be working on that side after 35 years of doing something else in subsurface characterization. So
what do you think, Danny? Where are you headed?
Yeah, I'll just say, 5-year horizon, crystal ball of sorts. We'd like to have at least 2 to 3 projects into commercial development. Would love to see that in Texas. But if you're not thinking about, and Mark mentioned sedimentary geothermal in Europe, if you're not thinking about geothermal in Europe right now, I don't, you know, from an energy standpoint, yeah, there could be just an explosion of development there. And Tim mentioned the regulatory component of that. There's absolutely some challenges to doing it, but that's, you know, there's no better place in the world to, in my opinion, to drill a well than in the state of Texas. So that's why we're focused on here and want to go scale that to the world and take it everywhere. But we could see some surprises. I think we will, you know, and Asia Pacific, certainly a ton of interest for geothermal, conventional and unconventional in South America, you know, North America, outside of the US even, lots of excitement about the opportunity. So I think we're going to be surprised by some of the projects that maybe somewhat under the radar for folks here in Texas or even in the US, but I think, you know, we have that demonstration and we can show that there's a pathway to commerciality. This thing is going to scale, and that's what gets us excited.
Awesome. So we got no time left. So we got 5 minutes, and we didn't make it. I'm sorry, audience, we didn't make it through 10% of the questions, but the panels, we don't have enough time in these things. But all right, for close, let's hear the vision for sedimentary geothermal. You know, what do you think? Where are we headed? You know, what's the impact going to be? What do you see, panelists? I'll call out your names and you start. You have a minute each for your closing statement. Let's start with Albert.
Again, I think there's just based on HPHT experience, there's a lot of opportunity out there. There's a lot of kit available on the completion side, on the drilling side. I think we can do this. I think closed loop as well as enhanced geothermal may have their own relative areas where they may have some advantages, but also risks. In terms of the shale revolution, I would mention, you know, there has been a lot of casing deformation issues as a part of the shale revolution. So we need to be be on the lookout for new areas, new risks that are going to factor into both the economics and the technology.
Thanks, Albert. How about you, Danny?
Yeah, sedimentary geothermal is the quickest pathway to scaling geothermal energy in a commercial way, and from our perspective. So just huge opportunity. All the tools and technologies that are focused on deeper, hotter, you know, harder rock, hot, dry rock applications absolutely need to advance. But we see sedimentary geothermal as being the quickest way to get to scale with commercial projects. In general.
Thanks, Danny.
So, thanks for your time today.
How about you, Tim?
So I'm super excited about sedimentary geothermal and geothermal in general. It's such a vast resource and available to us with newer technologies. I view it as displacing just about and it's controversial, I'm sure, displacing all other forms of fixed power. Basically, you could make a case that this could happen. And the beauty of geothermal is that the heat comes to you. You don't have to go search for it. It's coming to you once you've put something in the ground and got it going. So I think that's going to be the game changer. And it's just a matter of time. I think it's a when rather than an if. The only if is if we can get this thing proven up. Yeah.
And Mark?
There's a lot of exciting things happening in geothermal. Each of them has kind of pros and cons. Sedimentary geothermal has much lower technical risk and resource risk than probably any other geothermal application. And so as it is explored and proven out economically, you know, it does have huge room to run, and it's a very exciting area to watch.
Thanks, everybody. Awesome. So here's the deal. There are so many technical questions, and thank God I didn't have to ask them, because I would have had no idea even how to ask some of these. But here's the good news. Tomorrow, there are 2 startup companies that are doing sedimentary geothermal presenting in technical sessions, and they have very long Q&A. So we bring the technical questions and let's dig in with the companies that are out in the field that have demonstrations and see if we can get some of these questions answered. Thank you so much to this panel. This was fun. This was awesome. I love the discussion. And thanks to the audience for all the engagement. We'll see you all in the next session, and thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Take care, everyone.